fine-tuning of this world and also the universe, and how it is so incomprehensible that this is so fine-tuned that many have decided that maybe the whole issue of creating a multiverse hypothesis is one way of getting around the extreme fine-tuning of this universe. But as we discovered, that simply creates more problems, because now you have to somehow come up with an explanation of an infinite number of universes that came into being as opposed to a single one. And then we looked at design in nature, in different biological systems. We looked at DNA. In fact, we saw the fact that one of the leading atheistic philosophers of the second half of the 20th century, when they looked at the whole issue of DNA, changed their mind. This was someone who used to debate believers on university campuses, changed their mind and came to the conclusion that God exists. And this happened just in the last decade or so. There is much more we could say. This was a whole topic we dealt with. But when you consider evidence, there is a lot of evidence that God actually does exist. The question is, if you have a philosophy of scientific materialism, how do you deal with that? How do you grapple with it? Because it can't actually interact seriously with your own worldview that says there is no God, God cannot be used as an explanation for any of this. The point actually is very well made by Alvin Plantinga, who was one of the world's foremost, you could say, leading philosophers, based in the UK, in the US at Notre Dame. And note what he says about this whole issue of science and religion. People like Dawkins hold that there is a conflict between science and religion because they think there is a conflict between evolution and theism. The truth of the matter, however, is that the conflict is between science and naturalism, not between science and belief in God. That's a fascinating statement because it actually turns the usual ideas that people have on its head. Here it's saying the conflict isn't between science and belief in God. No, what's the conflict? The conflict is between science, which we described as being that method by which we investigate the universe, between what science and naturalism. Naturalism being what? Naturalism being a worldview that says that God does not exist. Now, to actually say it even, I think you could say in different words or even clearer, John Lennox from Oxford University. John Lennox, who a professor of mathematics, also professor of the philosophy of science, has debated Richard Dawkins on numerous occasions at various debates around the world. Interesting what he says. He says, there is a conflict, a very real one, but it is not really a conflict between science and religion at all. For if that was so, elementary logic would dictate that one would find that all scientists are atheists and only non-scientists would believe in God. And this is simply not the case. But he goes on and he says, no, the real conflict is between two diametrically opposed worldviews, naturalism and theism. They inevitably collide. Notice what he's saying there. He's saying it's not an issue between science and religion, it's an issue between two different worldviews. Ultimately, one worldview says there is no God, the other worldview says there is a God. And it depends on which worldview you're coming from, then you will interpret the facts, the data, the observations in a different way. Because you need to interpret in a way that tries to fit in with the theory or the worldview where you're coming from. I think this is very significant in the whole discussion of science and religion and is the first major point that I think we need to clearly understand. So when the media, or even when various scientists, universities or whatever, talk about the fact that there's a conflict with religion, well, we need to say, well, hey, well, look, what really are they saying? Is it really that the conflict is the religion, or is it the fact that there's an underlying worldview which is at play there? Now, there is one major issue, of course, which is usually discussed when it comes to the topic of science and religion. And there's no prizes for guessing that topic is evolution. Evolution, since Charles Darwin wrote his Origin of Species just over 150 years ago, has been something that has influenced the scientific world, in fact, the world massively at so many different levels. Its repercussions are massive and of course continuing. In fact, when it comes to science, it is considered to be one of the underpinnings of certainly biological sciences and indeed many of the physical sciences. And it's on that question that people say, well, hang on a minute. Now, evolution, surely that's considered fact. Certainly everybody educated, surely they believe in evolution. Well, hasn't evolution made, as one leading atheist said, well, evolution has made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Well, if that's the case, how do we address this issue of evolution? Now, has evolution buried God? Because many people seem to think so. Well, let's unpack evolution in a little bit more detail. First of all, we need to distinguish two entirely different concepts or two different words. The first one is the term macroevolution, or we can say it big evolution. Macro, the word macro being big. So really we're talking about large-scale evolution. On the other hand, there's another concept called microevolution. So what's that? Micro being small, small-scale evolution. And as you'll see in a moment, that distinction is very important. And the reason is that in at least the popular discussion of things, and I would suggest even amongst many academics, these are all lumped together and evolution is just evolution. And it's considered that, well, whatever evidence there is, one would obviously support the other, and so it's just one unified whole in terms of its concept. Well, let's unpack that a bit more. Well, first of all, what do we mean by a macroevolutionary model? Well, the idea is that the universe came into existence spontaneously. The idea there, well, the universe came into existence by itself and it just happened. So, as some would argue, the universe made itself or the universe created itself, which philosophically, well, look, that's a very interesting question of how that could happen. Certainly doesn't answer or is not consistent with any law of cause and effect that we would understand. The second point is that life evolved on Earth from non-organic chemicals. So what's that mean? Basically, there wasn't life, there was a bunch of atoms and molecules, and from those which were not living, there developed living beings, or life developed. Initially, of course, the first cell. And that is the first major issue of how the first cell came into being from non-life, because of course the cell is a fundamental building block of life. And then it's a matter of, after that, there's more complexity to develop. And so humans evolved from simple cells. Now, of course, many steps along the way. You can see a diagram there, simplified, of an evolutionary tree. You'll see that in any textbook of biology, where it actually illustrates the fact that there were very simple ancestors and increasing complexity developed over many millions and hundreds of millions of years, such that ultimately, well, humans are here and humans have arrived. Next point is that there was a progressive development from the simple to the complex over long periods of time involving change between species. So there's a bit there. So first of all, progressive development. So the idea is that it happened consistently and uniformly. And that theory is called neo-Darwinism. The idea that by a very slow accumulation of mutations and changes in the DNA, the material accumulated from the simple, and it went to the very complex. So if we were to imagine that a single cell had a single volume of information, then humans, in contrast, have many thousands of volumes of information in order to code for all the functions that are in the human body. And so went from the simple to the complex over long periods of time. Here we're talking about millions and many hundreds of millions of years. And the idea being that given enough time, then this process should be able to happen. And of course it involves change between species, because indeed one species would then over time give rise to another species, and so on. The macroevolutionary development would continue. And so essentially what you needed was a development of a first cell, and then that would develop into further simple cells, then complex cells. So basically in scientific jargon, from a prokaryotic cell to a eukaryotic cell, and then multicellular organisms, and ultimately complex life forms like animals and indeed humans. I remember when I was studying for my first degree at Macquarie University, when that was a science degree together with a diploma of education. And I remember one of the professors, this was in one of the science lectures, he was outlining the process of the development of life on Earth. And he said, we believe that out of the inorganic material, the first cell developed. He said, we don't know how it happened, but we believe it did. Then he said, after that, we believe that there were more complex cells that developed. We don't know how it happened, but we believe it did. And then after that, there were multicellular organisms. They developed. We don't know how, but we believe it did. And then finally, the macroevolution, the evolution into humans, we know it happened. We believe somehow it happened through an evolutionary process, but we don't know how it happened. And so when it came to each one of these steps, he was quite open about the fact that, well, this is how we believe the model happened, but we don't know how. But we believe it did. And I've got to say, I appreciated his honesty, because it is a massively difficult issue, because ultimately there is not a mechanism. I mean, people can come up with stories of how it might have happened in terms of a poetic description, which actually might sound good on a piece of paper, but ultimately when it comes to hard evidence and actually biochemical pathways in order to arrive at the development, not only don't we have those, but there are what I would argue insurmountable barriers to those happening at multiple steps along the pathway. And in fact, in the presentation that we'll have tomorrow about the origin of life on Earth, we can delve much more into some of these areas. So ultimately, you can see here that macroevolution is a view of how life developed, but this is the thing, as we will explore further, the experimental backing for it, and indeed the mechanism for it, is something which is lacking. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, when it comes to evidences for evolution that you will see in standard textbooks, the evidences don't come from macroevolution, because there are major problems. Even critics who are not believers are pointing out that there are major issues with macroevolution and its processes. In fact, it is within microevolution that where a lot of the evidence for evolution comes from. But as we will see, microevolution is simply the science of genetics and change within species. So let's go to microevolution. You can see some pictures of, I guess, some cute dogs, those who are dog people as opposed to those who might be cat people. But microevolution says that you just simply have change within a species. So, you have a dog, and the dog will reproduce, and it can breed with other dogs, and ultimately you can actually have change within what? Within the one species. You haven't created a new species. You've actually had, in scientific terms, a rearrangement of the genetic material where certain traits have been selected. Now, we know this in breeding of animals, where we do selective breeding. There are certain strains, there are certain traits that we want to breed for, and so those who are skilled at this will do this, so that there are certain traits which then are bred out, and then you'll have a purebred strain. We know about that. It could be in cats or dogs or, whatever animals that we want to do. This is a process that we can do. Now, what happens in that case? It's not as if we have had macroevolution. We have selected out traits that were simply there in existence in the genetic material to start with. There's nothing new that's been created. In actual fact, there's actually been a loss of information, because the information has been, how shall I say, focused and narrowed. And so the specific information is in the purebred, which means the broader information, which is in the non-purebred, in many cases goes missing. So there's actually less information genetically rather than more. Now, what also happens is the change is due to differences in the expression of existing DNA. So we're not modifying the DNA, we're actually expressing the existing DNA in a different way. And critically, the mechanisms have been described by science. The science of genetics, for example. In high school you remember Mendel's peas, and we learnt about different eye colours and dominant and recessive genes and all sorts of things like that. And we were able to have quite an understanding of these things. So when it comes to microevolution, well, in fact, this is what many of the examples are and the arguments are that you'll find in textbooks. So what did Charles Darwin do? He sailed around the world, he went to the Galapagos Islands, and you remember the story. He observed and he drew pictures of the finches, and they had different shaped beaks. And so he concluded from there that there was an evolutionary process. Well, what we know now is that the different beaks are just simply natural selection. Now, what does natural selection mean? Natural selection means that it selects from the existing genetic material. It's not as if there's new material being developed, it selects from the existing material. Now, the word natural selection is used a lot when it comes to evolution and arguments for evolution. But that's a critical point. Natural selection selects what is there. It doesn't build and develop a new material. Other examples you may have heard of, the peppered moths. You know the story where before the Industrial Revolution there were the white moths, and when they went on the trees they seemed to do well because they weren't seen by the predators as much, and the black ones, they stood out, and so the birds would come and they would eat the ones which actually stood out. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, what happened? A lot of pollution, there was a lot of black soot on the trees, and so now it was the dark ones there, the black moths, they were camouflaged, but the white ones could easily be seen, and so they were the ones who were eaten. Now, tell me, and look, having said that, that whole issue is now in question because it seems that some of the initial photographs or drawings were, how shall I say, specially made. But that aside, even if it was something that was actually documented, what does it show? It just simply shows that there is natural selection, which isn't evidence of change. It's just evidence that certain genetic traits were selected for. It's just simply explained there. It's microevolution. It's just change within an existing species. Now, why have I laboured this point? The reason is that there is a general understanding, acceptance within culture that evolution has been demonstrated as fact. But what you'll find is it's the arguments for microevolution that are put forward as being the evidence for evolution in totality. But this is why we've got to distinguish, because we can argue the facts for microevolution, but that does not mean that we can extrapolate those arguments and say because microevolution has been demonstrated that somehow macroevolution also is demonstrated as part of it. You can see the importance there of labels. If you have a label, evolution generically, which attaches to all of it, well, of course, a scientist will look at someone who says, look, I don't believe in evolution, or I have a problem with evolution, as thinking, well, they're very uneducated. Why? Because this whole issue of natural selection and change within species, well, that's labelled as being part of evolution. So obviously someone who denies that doesn't understand science and doesn't understand the mechanisms. But it's only when we distinguish between the two that we can speak clearly about what we mean in terms of microevolution, in terms of macroevolution, and distinguish, because that distinction then has implications for what we mean by God and by religion and by science and their relationship. Now, there is, of course, then a different model of the interaction between science and religion. Now, of course, there is an idea that God created. The creation model is very interesting because it's obviously been vigorously opposed by the scientific community, inverted commas. I remember when I was, again, doing my science degree and teaching at Macquarie University, and in my final year of teacher training, we had a 2-hour tutorial of sorts, which is a practical session where in that particular class there were about 20 trainee science teachers. And we would meet together each week and we would discuss issues to do with the delivery and basically the teaching of science in the classroom. As part of, and this was the last semester of the entire course, as part of that, there was a 10-minute presentation that each member of the class had to give. And that was always towards the end of the 2-hour segment. Well, I saw the list and I quickly raised my hand because there was one that interested me. And I got it, and the topic was creation science. Very controversial. Remember, this is a secular university. I found out later that one of the other guys I knew who was in a lot of my science classes, he was a bit disappointed because he was an ardent atheist, macroevolutionist, and he was keen to take that topic because he was going to just shred this whole issue of creation science. Well, as it turned out, I thought, well, this would be interesting. So I did a lot of research on it. And on the day of the tutorial, I came in, sat at the front of the class and started unpacking my bag and taking out a number of books. And look, I guess everyone was watching, what was this all about? And so the lecturer said, well, look, hey, why don't we do your segment now? And then, because obviously with all those books there, it was a bit of a distraction. So, all right, we started on it. Well, guess what? We didn't go for 10 minutes. We actually didn't go for 20 minutes. We ended up going the lecturer had to stop it at 1.5 hours. We would have probably gone the whole day. It was a vigorous discussion. And seriously, it went backwards and forwards. But look, I've got to say, it was done in a very good spirit, and it was done in a way which I think the whole group was very open-minded. But I was very happy at the end of that because as a group, and when I reflect on this, I think it's actually an amazing conclusion. As a group, we came to 3 conclusions that as a group we were comfortable with. The first one was that in terms of a macroevolutionary model, there were significant problems. And it was acknowledged that, yes, there were problems with the model as they were expected to teach. The second point was that indeed there was some evidence in support of an alternative being a creation model. Now, that might be okay to do that, but the third one was what really astounded me, and that was that the teachers-to-be, and the professor was there as well, but the teachers-to-be came to the conclusion that as future teachers, they should not teach the theory of macroevolution as being the only answer or the only theory, but should actually give due weight to other theories and actually make their class or their students aware that indeed there are other alternatives out there to just the macroevolutionary theory. Which I've got to say, I was thrilled that we were able to, as a group, come up with that consensus. So it's interesting, people talk about a creation model and initially, people think, well, hang on, well, how can we look at that? How is that real? Well, look, what does a creation model actually suggest? Well, first of all, that God created the universe, the earth, and its original inhabitants. So as opposed to the universe coming into existence all by itself, there was an intelligent mind behind it all. God brought it all into being. Next point is that humans are created in the image of God. The idea was that humans didn't come into existence through a random process over many hundreds of millions of years, starting with a single cell and then working up in complexity in order to a human being, but rather humans were quite created in the image of God. Now that's significant because if they're created in the image of God, then there is a certain intrinsic value there because God is the one who actually did the creating. Now, significantly here, sin was the cause of death. Death is not something which is part of the preferred order of things as far as God is concerned. Death is something which is foreign. Death is not something which is part of the plan. And the creation model says that indeed sin was the thing that led to death, rather than the process of death and suffering bringing into being what we know now as life and complicated life. Now, John Lennox, again, who I've mentioned now from Oxford University, he makes a very interesting statement as well regarding this. He says, the more we get to know about our universe, the more the hypothesis that there is a creator God who designed the universe for a purpose gains in credibility as the best explanation for why we're here. Now, there are many other scientists I could quote who say similar things, which is interesting. As Lennox said in a previous quote, it's not as if all the scientists somehow don't believe in God. There are multiple scientists who believe in God. It's not as if somehow some science means that people shouldn't believe in God. Now, when we come to what the Christian scriptures themselves say, look, in Genesis 1:1, in the very beginning of the Christian scriptures, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So it's actually put out there very plainly and boldly. And then a little bit further in that first part of the book of Genesis, it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. It's very plain that humans are special. Why? Because God made them, but he also made them in his image. And that is something which, as we reflect on, gives us a lot of encouragement and confidence that in fact we have an intrinsic value. Why? Because God has made us and he's made us in his image. It's interesting there, male and female he created them. One of the big issues in terms of macroevolution is how do you have the origin of sexuality, of gender, of male and female? There's not a lot of point having one without the other. They both need to appear at the same time, and that is a tricky question. But here it says that male and female, he created them. So God was the one who created gender. There's also a passage here which I think is highly significant, and that is found in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. For by him, that is in Christ, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. Now, this is where the Christian scriptures very clearly identify Jesus Christ as being the creator. Now, in a previous session, we've looked at the person of Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus Christ? There's no question he was a historical figure. There's no question that he lived on earth, that he also died, and as we looked at previously, there is compelling evidence that he rose from the dead. So Jesus is someone who is special, someone who is extraordinary. But interestingly, in this passage, it also identifies him as a creator. Now, this is where we get to the question of the relationship between science and religion. If indeed Jesus Christ is God, if Jesus Christ came to earth, lived, died, and was resurrected from the dead, if he indeed is the creator, then it makes sense that as we observe science, we would actually be led to the fact that there is evidence for a creation. And it's interesting that there are scientists, including, as I mentioned previously, Anthony Flew, for example, the atheistic philosopher, the globally renowned philosopher, who when he looked at DNA and when he looked at design, he came to the conclusion there is a God. As we look in nature, we can see the fingerprints of God. Now, of course, there are things which are imperfect in nature. And as we've looked at the creation model, we saw that it was through sin entering the world that death came in. And of course, it was as a result of that that there has been degeneration and imperfection. But that's a topic we'll look at a little bit more later. But what is highly instructive in this whole discussion between science and religion is that when we consider that Jesus Christ is the one who is put forward as the creator, it suddenly, of course, doesn't make any sense, this whole philosophy of scientific materialism. What we have there is not a conflict between science and religion. As we've seen, the conflict is really between two different worldviews. One worldview that says that God does not exist, and there's another worldview that says God does exist. So, to the question, has science buried God? Well, I think the answer, at least in my mind, is very clear. Absolutely not.